Hi, welcome back. I actually got back from a vacation just a couple of weeks ago. My family and I went to Italy, and we spent the second week of that vacation in Florence, one of my favorite Italian cities. Now, I know you're not supposed to work on your vacation, and I didn't. Didn't write any emails or no papers, no thinking deeply about investing, but I really can't help myself. Help myself in what sense? Well, whenever I see a lesson out in the real world, I'm looking to see what does it tell me about investing. So as I looked up at the absolutely amazing dome in Florence that Brunelleschi built, or at Michelangelo's David, much as I enjoyed being in the moment, I kept thinking about what are the lessons for investing that I could get from these great Renaissance masters. So I know this might be stretching and you might not like this particular session, but here it goes. For those of you who've never been to Florence, I'd strongly suggest that you get there sometime during your lifetime, because to me this is the most beautiful dome in the world. I've seen St. Peter's in Rome and the Sophia in Istanbul, but this remains to me the most beautiful dome in the world. To give you some sense of history, this is the church in Florence, construction on which was begun in 1296. And 1296, Europe was in the Dark Ages. Dark Ages in what sense? It's been about 800 years kind of abandoning everything they could about science and art. I mean, people were ruled by superstition and religion, and then came the Renaissance. And this church was the opening of the Renaissance in the sense that the church construction started in 1296. About 50 years later, they had to stop construction of the church for two reasons. One was the Black Death, the plague had arrived. The other was the plans for the church actually called for a freestanding dome. A huge dome, a dome larger than any that had ever been built before, and nobody knew how to build a dome. But in a remarkable show of faith, the people who constructed the church constructed the rest of the church and left the dome undone, convinced that somebody would come along, somebody later in the process who would know how to do it and would complete the dome. Well, their faith got rewarded, because about 100 years later, a Florentian named Brunelleschi came up with a plan to build the dome. Now, of course, this didn't come overnight. He was given the task of building the dome, and he went about doing his research. And part of his research was actually visiting the Pantheon in Rome. For those of you who visited the Pantheon, this goes back to the 2nd century. It was standing 1,000 years before Brunelleschi's dome, but nobody quite knew how the Romans built the Pantheon. The plans were long since destroyed, and anything that people knew about building the dome was long since forgotten. But after a few fits and starts, Brunelleschi did what was considered impossible. He constructed a freestanding dome, and the way he got it standing it was extraordinarily ingenious. It was a dome within a dome, and he used 6 arches to kind of sustain the weight of the dome. And guess what? 600 years later, the dome still stands amazing up there. So, what are the lessons you can learn from investing from Brunelleschi's dome? Here's the first one. I've always wondered about faith. I mean, after all, if you think about investing is as much about faith as it is about numbers. Faith in your own valuations, and most importantly, faith that the market will correct its mistakes. And let's face it, even if you are a value investor, which is where I would put myself in the classic sense of the word, I've had my moments where faith gets tested. In what sense? Well, you buy a stock that you think is undervalued. You do your homework, you value the company. The price is much lower, you buy the stock. And instead of the market correcting towards your value, it moves in the opposite direction. Admit it, your faith is being tested. And we wonder how long we can hold on. And as investors, we get impatient. 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. Oh my God, it's not adjusted yet. Something must be wrong. Sooner or later, most of us abandon our faith. As I looked at the dome and thought about those Florentians who built the church and were willing to wait 100 years, maybe give me an entirely new perspective on faith. The next time I buy a stock, I don't think I can wait 100 years, but to me, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months might just be the start of the process. If I truly have faith, I should be willing to wait a lot longer. So maybe I can start constructing a true faith in investing as I go through this process. The second lesson that you can learn by looking at this dome is, especially in today's world, we have access to incredible data and these sophisticated models. We're tempted to believe that we're better than past investors, that we're not as unsophisticated as they were, not as uninformed as they were, and therefore we're less immune to we're in fact more immune to the kinds of mistakes that they used to make. We think we can't make those mistakes anymore. Well, remember when Brunelleschi sat down to build the dome in Florence, there was another dome that had been constructed more than 1,000 years prior. The ancient Romans actually figured out how to build the dome. They just never passed it on. What do I learn from this from markets? In markets, every time we think we've discovered something new, what we've really discovered is something old repackaged and offered as new. We have this bad practice in markets of repeating our old mistakes over and over again and not learning stuff that prior generations have learned and forgotten. Like the ancient Romans who built the Pantheon and then proceeded to make that knowledge kind of disappear. A lot of investors learned lessons, and they learned them in the 1920s, the 1940s, the 1960s, the 1980s, but those lessons seem to disappear into thin air. Maybe the lesson we should get from Brunelleschi's dome is the next time you think that something has never happened before, maybe take a look at history, because my guess is it's happened before. We've just chosen to forget it. And the classic refrain of "this time will be different" is often what's running in the back of your head, but maybe it's not going to be that different. And the third and final lesson, and this feeds into an obsession of mine, which I would hope you'd humor me with for a few minutes. For the last few months, perhaps the last couple of years, I've been making the case that good investing, good valuation requires a combination of skills. A skill at storytelling and a skill at number crunching. And as I looked at the dome, that's what came to mind. The great Renaissance artists, and Brunelleschi was not the only one, recognized that to create great art, they had to harness science. And that the great scientists needed art. So the line we draw between are you an artist or a scientist seemed to be absent during the Renaissance. And maybe it's time we rediscovered that melding of skills, that you get much better investing if you can meld together the art part of it, the storytelling, with the science part of it, the number crunching, because by itself, a bunch of numbers, just a bunch of numbers, and by itself, a story can be a fairy tale. So keep that in mind the next time you construct a valuation, that you don't have to be a Brunelleschi, but if you can try to pull off a Brunelleschi, you'd be combining a pretty good story with a pretty good valuation. So what's the bottom line? Maybe it's time for a renaissance in investing. Maybe we're in the dark ages. Maybe we have our own version of superstitions and rules of thumb that still govern how we invest. And if you think about a Renaissance man, these were words that I'd heard before I went to Florence, but to me, it has new meaning. A Renaissance man, Renaissance woman, if you prefer a less sexist term, is really somebody who can combine skills across disciplines. And I think in a world of specialization, we have too few Renaissance people. We have a lot of specialists, people who live in their silos and can talk to other people just like them. But we have very few people who can span the disciplines, who can go across markets, who can think big picture in the best sense of the word, and who can maintain conversation, who can actually talk with people in the trenches, to those who trade stocks, those who trade bonds, those who do traditional valuations, those who use charts. I know I'm not even close to being able to do that, but it's a skill well worth developing, and I hope to work on it in the months and years to come. Thank you very much for listening.